Hey, look, who's a couple of old-timers back-to-back. Merlin Wendelboe wants to know. So someone was claiming Reaganomics did not work. I said, if by work you mean it didn't turn the USA into a socialist nation, then you're right. But what do they mean by work? And what do we mean when we say it did work? The metric for Reagan's success is Jimmy Carter. And not that that's a hard, comparison to win. That's not just saying you're a better guy than Jimmy Carter is not exactly clothing yourself in, unimpeachable glory. However, it's difficult for many of us to remember just how awful this country was in 1979, 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected. The economy was in absolute stagnation. Much more evident than that was the idea that the military was not just the military was not just underpaid, underfunded, underfinanced, and so on. Their morale was probably you could make a pretty compelling case that the late 70s was the absolute nadir of morale in the United States military. I think it was lower than it was during the Vietnam War. I remember being in college and waking up and hearing the news of, was it Desert One? The rescue attempt. And we put, 4, 5, 6 helicopters out in the desert. And at a staging area before we even got anywhere near Tehran, there's this, dust cloud kicks up and these helicopters collide and there's dead Americans and burned wreckage and we have to leave them there. It's a catastrophe. It wasn't just a failed mission. It was a mission that it was failed. They failed before they even got to the mission. Things blew up before they even got on the mission, and that was the world of Jimmy Carter. And this was what he'd let the military, devolve to. And we forget about the labor issues and so on that were going on all the time in the strikes before Ronald Reagan. The Soviets. After the nice thing about the Cold War ending is you get to talk to people who used to be your adversaries, especially when you win. And same thing with the Germans after World War II. We got to look at OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht memos and so on, and find out what the other side was thinking. And virtually all of the people who have had anything to say about it on the Soviet side, all of them, pretty much to a person, say that the thing that made them realize what and who Ronald Reagan was the air traffic controller strike. And that was that was a month or two into his presidency. And basically, we'd been hit with all these labor strikes all across the country. I can't remember a strike in America. I honestly can't. I cannot remember a labor strike in America, national strike now, on the level of the things we used to see and that used to just paralyze Britain. I just don't remember seeing a strike in this country for 20, 30 years having any effect at all. There may be there. I just don't remember any of them. But, these things were happening all the time prior to Reaganomics and Ronald Reagan and the whole idea. And when the air traffic controllers struck, they were government employees. It was in their contract. They're not allowed to strike. And they decided to strike anyway, figuring that, if we tie up all of America's air travel, that gives us a fair amount of leverage, gives them a tremendous amount of leverage is what it does. But it didn't make it right. And Ronald Reagan didn't negotiate on this. He basically said, okay, that you're not, when you took the job, you knew that since you're in this public sector, strike is not an option for you. You knew this when you took the job. And since you are now going to threaten a strike, that is a violation of your work contract, so you either go to work on this day or you're all fired. And they thought he was bluffing, and he wasn't bluffing. He fired them all of them at Patco. And that impressed the Soviets very much. I'd love to tell you it impressed me, but I was too stupid to know anything about it at the time. But it is... the thing about the Patco strike that was so remarkable was not that Ronald Reagan went in there and busted up a union. He was the entire point was this is not a negotiable position, because you know going into this that you don't have this. This is not a tool that you have. It's not about whether your grievances are legitimate or not. It's no, we're not going to negotiate this because you are basically violating the law. We're not going to tolerate it, and it caused some problems. It caused real problems. I remember I have a friend who was a air traffic controller in the Air Force. He got pressed in at working at Palm Beach, Florida Tower for a while there. And it took a while to get the thing back up and running, but Reagan didn't seem to have a question with it. Cutting the regulations, that people point out, well, Ronald Reagan increased the budget deficit. It's true, and taxes and so on. True, but the Roaring '80s were the result of the attitude that came down from the top, and the attitude was one of confidence. And we get right down to it, folks. That's really what it comes down to. It may not sound like much, but it's actually the whole shooting match. An economy is a confidence. I don't want to say it's a confidence game, because that gives you the impression that it's illegitimate. But the entire idea of an economy is based on confidence. It's based on the idea that if I go into McDonald's and I hand somebody a piece of paper with a picture of Abraham Lincoln on it, they're going to give me actual food or somewhat food-like matter in exchange for it. And if that's based on confidence, and all of the economic growth is based on confidence. When people decide to invest in something, that's a question of, do they have the confidence? And when the entire country is filled with this malaise, which goes back to Ford as well, it's not entirely Jimmy Carter's fault, but this whole kind of, we're just, Jimmy Carter sitting there saying we're going to have to put on our sweaters, and the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, dear God, that was that was as close as communism has ever come to America, as far as I'm concerned, is the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. I remember that so clearly. I was living at the University of Florida, going back and forth between Gainesville and Orlando a lot. It's probably a 4.5, 5-hour drive today, but it was 6 or 7 with that speed limit. And the Florida Turnpike is like, imagine 60 shuttle runways laid end to end, and then cranking it 10 degrees to the left, and then putting another 60 shuttle runways, laying those end to end, and cranking it 10 degrees to the right, flat as a board. This is the most boring drive in the history of the world. And to do the Florida Turnpike at 55 miles an hour was virtually unbearable. And we did it because, we can't get our own energy, and, these Arabs have kind of got us, and we're going to have to conserve, and, it was just terrible. It was terrible. So, yeah, Reagan set the ruin of this country back by 25 or 30 years. And then, after the success of that, Reagan won the Cold War. Well, he did, and he did it consciously. It wasn't an accident. It was strategical policy. It was brilliant strategery on the part of Ronald Reagan, and he understood it. And he was maybe the only person in the entire national command structure level who did understand it. Basically, people were saying Star Wars is not going to work. Ronald Reagan's an idiot. There's no way that Star Wars is going to work. It can't possibly shoot down 25,000 incoming warheads. And Ronald Reagan goes, well, yes, it can. Yes, it can. We're going to put a lot of money into it. Turns out that Ronald Reagan knew that there was no way that this was going to work. But what he did know was that the Soviets were spending 25, 30, 40% of their GDP on defense. We were spending 3-4% of GDP on our defense. And Reagan understood that, well, instead of fighting these Russians where they're strong, which is with tanks and stuff, why don't we fight them where we're strong, which is with the economy? Why don't we do something that's very, very expensive, and we're going to feel it? It's not trivial expense, but we can afford it, and they can't. They can't afford it. And that's why he didn't give up Star Wars at Reykjavik. And I was such an idiot at the time. I thought this is the end of civilization. That was our last chance to have a negotiated deal with the Russians. And Ronald Reagan walked out of there because he wanted to keep Star Wars. That stupid ancient old fool. And there was a stupid ancient old fool in that equation, all right? And it was me. It was genius. And it broke the Soviet Union. They just simply couldn't keep up. Gorbachev was not there to destroy the Soviet system. He was a dyed-in-the-wool communist. Gorbachev wanted to keep Soviet power. But he knew that the economy was every day the U.S. economy was pulling further and further away from the Soviets. And even then, at the beginning of the information age, he could see that there's just no way they were ever going to possibly catch up with us unless they did some fundamental restructuring, some perestroika, and have some glasnost, some openness, so that these parts of this fossilized economy could finally start talking to each other, maybe make something. He had to do it because they couldn't afford to compete with us. They had to change things. And by letting a little bit of light in there, that was the end of the whole thing. Once you allow a little bit of light, a little bit of truth into the communist system, the thing just fell down. I don't know if Reagan knew it was going to happen that fast. I suspect he didn't know that. But he did understand very clearly that this is an evil force out there. And instead of trying to build as many tanks as they do and try and fight them in Germany and some other catastrophe like that, why don't we just look at the numbers? What's the spreadsheet say? We're spending 3, 4, 5% of our GDP on defense. They're spending 25, 30, 40%. Let's run those numbers up. Let's double them if we have to. We can afford to spend 7 or 8% of our GDP on defense. It's a lot of money, but we could afford it if we had to. But there's no way they could spend 80% of their 70% of their GDP on defense. It was brilliant. That's Reaganomics. It's all Reaganomics. It's the confidence of a guy who said, no, this country's great, and get out there and make some money because it's good. It's good to work hard and make money. You deserve it. This is what freedom's all about. He wasn't all about, well, we need to lower the speed limit from 55 to 50 to 40 because you know, these the OPEC cartel is charging more money. No, he just didn't do it. He didn't do it. And so I think he was a tremendous asset, and I think that no matter what leftists want to say about him, he beat the Soviet Union. He kick-started this economy. He provided this peace benefit, dividend rather, that Bill Clinton got to coast on for 8 years. And yeah, I think that the case for Reagan is airtight. All right, we'll do a couple more, and then I'm going to have to go back to work.